When you're designing one of these, this thing is too low for whatever reason. And so you have to go way down like this. Secondly, these lights are wimpy. They just don't do anything. So you can't see anything. So it's very difficult. So I've forgotten a couple of things. For example, when I showed this bust of Jefferson by Udom, I said he tried to make him look like a frontiersman. Well, of course, that's what he was, and that's what he almost in a way reinvented the American frontier. When it seemed closed at the Mississippi at the beginning of the 19th century, he just gave us all the rest of this. And of course, it's called Louisiana Purchase, and of course St. Louis is right here, and that's the spot from which they took off up the Missouri, for example, Lewis and Clark. And it's a wonderful spot in the geography of the country because that's where the Missouri comes into the Mississippi, right there. And the whole history of this area is in its names. This area, for example, between the two rivers is called Portage des Sioux. Some of you know the Portage of the Sioux. And St. Louis has a suburb called Spanish Lake and another one called Crèvecoeur. And that's the history, Spain, France, and then finally the Americans. And Stephen Vincent Benet, whom I quoted to you last time, maybe too much, who wrote that epic poem, John Brown's Body, in 1928, which was very popular when I was young. I don't suppose anybody reads it now. But in the beginning, he talks about the American muse, what makes the American character. And he says, the black-robed priests who broke their hearts in vain to make you God in France or God in Spain. And that's really all there in St. Louis. Then he says, the homesick men begot high cheekbone things whose wit was filled with a different sound, and Thames and all the rivers of the kings ran into Mississippi and were drowned. Because that's really what he does there. Grand new scale, a vast new modern scale that he creates there. The other thing was he also is the one, despite his own preferences, who set the surveyors out with the grids so that all of the America that was created out there was created on a grid plan. A grid plan, well, as far as the size, when the states finally get to the point where they can just draw the grid on the land, that's where they're happiest, right here at Four Corners. And then the quarter sections that were sold out to pioneers are on the grid. And the great plans of the counties are on the grid. And then finally, the city that grew up as a result of all this, the major city, the second greatest city in the United States, Chicago, really grew up because it became the center of all the transportation. Look at all these railway lines. St. Louis is sort of second, you see it down through here. But it's really Chicago right there. And Chicago, of course, is the most famous grid plan, perhaps, in American architectural history. Because there you have a peculiar situation. You have the Chicago River coming in across the absolutely flat prairie. And here, this peneplain right here, it comes out into Lake Michigan right here. And this right here becomes the heart of Chicago, becomes the center of it all. And even more so when the suburban railway line that connects downtown with all the suburbs that stretch unimpededly out there across the prairie makes a loop. Goes back out like that. So this area comes to be called the Loop. And as you know, in 1871, there was an enormous fire. It wiped out almost all that center, almost all the Loop. And when they rebuilt, they raised the level of the ground considerably, regularized the grid. So you had basically a square grid here. Within that loop, the railway line is coming down, coming across, going out, going back out there. Basically a square grid with the railroad taking over the frontage here. No green, all of that squeezed out by money and by real estate pressures. Some of the grid up here changing into long, thin blocks up here, making a different building condition, but the main thing here being the square. And then the building type changed. The original building type, like that of downtown New York after James Bogardus, and St. Louis and so on, was cast iron. And so it's all iron and glass. And one would say, well, that's the future, that's the modern type. But of course, the main thing was, it it was not fireproof. And in 1871, it was seen that some of the iron gave way long before the big, heavy wooden girders were eaten through. So the type that came had to be sheathed in masonry. And the basic type that there is the type that conforms to the grid, basically. Basically a block, like the Italian palazzo, which is the name of a block. Fare un giro del palazzo, is to go around the block. And the most important one, of course, is the Marshall Field Warehouse by Henry Hobson Richardson of 1885, 86. Now, you can see that warehouse almost describes where those iron and glass facades went, because the iron frame went inside. And the interior of the Marshall Field Warehouse is all this wonderful forest and in a grid of iron columns, and then it's fireproofed on the outside, like this, against city fires. And one wonderful way, I'll talk about it a lot more, that Jefferson clads it with the heavy masonry. He somehow clads it so you feel that it's bursting with open space inside, which it is, and that it's supported inside on a frame, a slender frame. It's as if that skin, which has a certain thickness and body, is slid down over an active frame, which is inside it. Now, of course, that's an enormous variation on the basic type. And the way that type develops is what I'd like to talk about today. Now, the Chicago skyscrapers have been one of the most important topics for American historiography throughout my lifetime, since the 1940s on. But most of those descriptions, I think, have been oversimplified and also have been shaped by modernist prejudices. That is to say, it was really foreigners like Siegfried Gideon in Space, Time, and Architecture in 1941 that made you feel that the whole thing came from the frame. Once they invented the steel frame carrying its own fireproofing, then you had the whole system. But the whole way the frame is designed, the whole way the whole surface is designed, the way the building fits into the city, none of that has really been described. Well, it's been described some, but it needs to be described some more. It needs to be focused on that. For example, he chooses clearly the palazzo type. If you take the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, this is pretty much what you've got. Regular rustication of the whole thing, basically an urban block. That's the type. But then it's changed enormously, as I've already said, by those arches, for example, by those smaller windows below and continuity of windows up at the top. And those come from two pre-existing 19th century buildings. The first is the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris. I'm tired of this on that row, in the third row. You. There's been a lot of talking from you for a long time. I'd appreciate it. Thank you. The Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris by Henri Labrouste of 1843 to 1850, for example, is really the background for those arches within which you have solid and void. You have the spandrel or the enclosing wall, and you have the glass. You have the two types on it. This is 1843, 1850, but there's one even before that, which is in Germany, in Berlin, and it's the architecture school, appropriately enough, the Bauer Academy by Carl Friedrich Schinkel of 1830-32. And you see, Richardson gets these windows from Schinkel. And he gets these vertical windows here and basically just adds to their continuity across the top. And he gets the block shape of the whole thing. So those two buildings are extremely important. And the way they develop, the way they work into the Marshall Field Warehouse is worth talking about a little bit. First of all, Berlin. I mean, Berlin is a city, of course, that's been rarely as popular with Americans or with American historians as Paris has been, for many different reasons, many of them political. But of course, in the 1920s, it was as lively a center of modern art and innovation and modern life as Paris was, with a different tone, a rather biting tone of its own. But the story of Berlin as it develops as an imperial city in the 19th century really, in a way, starts with Carl Friedrich Schinkel. And if we can take the major street here, Unter den Linden, that is, under the linden trees, that runs down here through the heart of Berlin to what's called the Museum Island, the Museum Insel, right here, which is in the River Spree, which comes down here through Berlin. And it even has its own customs house right here. And the Royal Palace, which unfortunately was turned down. Well, all this was East Berlin during the division of Berlin. This unfortunately was torn down, and a big, fairly unattractive building was built here, which is now almost a ruin, but which everybody who lived in East Berlin at that time loved, because that's the place they had a good time. It was really a center that apparently did work for them, for their clubs, for their cinemas, for their dancing and so on. So they're fighting against its demolition. For a long time, they wanted to build this back after the reunification of Berlin. And for quite a while, they had a model of it, of a good deal of it, in canvas, painted with the details of the original, up there to see how it would look. But still, they haven't built it back, and it's not sure whether they'll tear down this building right here. Then, as you know, Unter den Linden runs out this way, about the same length that you see here, to the Brandenburg Gate. Then beyond that is the Tiergarten, the park, with monuments on that avenue going out to West Berlin. Now, Schinkel comes along just at the moment when Prussia, which Berlin is the capital, achieves independence from Napoleon in 1815, finally. The Battle of Leipzig, and then after that, Napoleon falls. And in 1816, he builds the first monument, which is a national monument. It's called the Neue Wache, the new guardhouse. And you see it there. And then he goes on, and across here, he builds the museum, which then right away they begin to call the old museum, the Altes Museum. Even before that, starting in 1818, he builds here a great theater, a great modern theater, in between two pre-existing churches, right like this. This is 1818 to 20. This is about 22 to 27. Then he goes on and he builds over here in 1826, he builds the new customs house over here. So he had the Royal Palace, the French Gardens, new museum, and then in 1831 he builds the architecture school, the Bau Academy. And this one too was torn down. All this was in East Berlin, tragically. Now, if it's still there, and it was last summer, they have a model of this up, all painted red, because this was a hard red Prussian brick. And it contrasted with the stone, the masonry of all the other buildings, as to whether they'll rebuild that or not. So we don't know. They may rebuild it or they may not. Now the first one is this one, right there on that main street that takes the reviews going here to the Royal Palace, over here. And the interior has been slightly remodeled over and over again, but it's kept the basic theme. The main space is this open space behind it. There are offices and things on both sides, which curiously enough, I'm sorry I don't have a slide, behind this brick facade are Prussian brick, behind this masonry facade, this finely cut Greek masonry facade, you have Prussian brick there behind it. Inside at the present time, the monument keeps changing depending on the regime. The Nazis had it be a memorial to the soldiers of the First World War. Now, after the reunification and Germany thinking through its past and its future in ways that are extremely fascinating, it's more interesting than any other city that way because, in a way, it suffered more. It suffered from itself, with a sense of guilt that they've struggled with and faced, I think, as maybe some other countries haven't. And this is now a monument to all prisoners of all kinds, to all victims. And it has a blown-up statue by Kathy Kollwitz, who was a proletarian woman, draftsman and sculptor in the early 20th century. Her monument is here, and that's all there is. It's very German. It's very, very sad. And Mies did a program for this, which looks a lot like this, except it didn't have a statue right there. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread. Anyway, now if you look at that building, it doesn't really have any of the inventive, high-spirited, strange combination of shapes that the first generation of French Romantic classicists had. like Ledoux here in this customs house in Paris, where he has a widely stretched facade, and he has these B-flat pilasters, and he has columns up here around it in a very Roman way, and a big cylinder over this vastly stretched out facade. It doesn't have that at all. It's gotten tight. It's gotten exact. It's beautifully made. It looks like the front of a Mercedes-Benz, which you might say is almost modeled on it in its classic days. At the same time, it's not really academic. If you look up above those Doric columns, which are, they look like the Hephaestion or something like that in Athens, tight little city temple here. Up above, where you should have triglyphs and metopes, he has this wonderful conceit of victories, which are running back and forth, so he makes this space very dynamic. These figures are running back and forth toward each other. And if you contrast it with Jefferson at exactly the same time, the University of Virginia, see how careful Jefferson is. Jefferson gets it all from the book. Those are tracings from Renaissance details of the way to handle triglyphs and metopes. Very tight, very linear, but this is very free, very active, and very, very sculptural. And the same thing really is true of the Bau Academy. Here, it's a great big theater which looks like a great big modern building. If you saw this built today, you'd hardly be surprised in many places. Mostly glass, great simple plan going with coming into the square, great big Greek frontispiece, big theater housing, big stage housing behind, the whole thing just full of, it's symmetrical, but it's full of glass, full of light, it's full of sense of exuberance, kind of buoyancy. And it's placed wonderfully. It's placed very contextually in relation to those two existing churches, which are right here. Placed back between them. Here, it doesn't have the high towers that it does, but this is the way you see it, really. In the winter, when it's cold in Berlin and damp, there's a lot of snow, and you have that phenomenon that we hit over and over again, and I think you get it in the buildings of the work of Creer. You get the conjunction of the classical southern Mediterranean vocabulary and then the northern temperament, the northern winter. And one of the most striking things about Germany all through the modern period has been this curious pull toward the Mediterranean, this pull toward the classic, which also has death and darkness in it. Thomas Mann, in one of his great stories, talks about his hero falling asleep in the snow and having a dream of a Greek temple by the Mediterranean with the enormous columns, and he goes past the columns, and there two old women are dismembering a child. You get this contrast, this surrealist sense. The South is full of this excitement for the high European romantic mentality, but also there's that sense of blood, strange, and it's very beautiful here. This is the kind of feeling you get in St. Petersburg, too. Same quality there. Now, the major building, in a way, it came along then, right there in 1828 or so, is the new gallery, which is soon called the Old Gallery, the Altes Museum. Sorry, I haven't turned these lights down. Sorry, I really do apologize. And these are, you see, it's right at the end of Unter den Linden, where it goes over to the island, and there it is there, in this painting of the time. And you really get just in this one building, you get as a setting for a kind of imperial bigness, great range of columns, high in dimension, the whole thing giving a sense of a kind of new imperial vision. Now, it's only in the next decade, or just very shortly after this, that Thomas Cole paints in America his Course of Empire. And there is the romantic view of what happens to empires. As you remember, in that group of paintings, a whole series of paintings in the New York Historical Society, he starts with a bay which has a headland. And this headland appears in all the paintings. The first one, it's almost all empty, except for a few sort of Stonehenge-like things around. Then you get a few temples in the landscape. Finally, you get full empire here. Here is empire. All is great. It looks like this blown up on the island. More and more things develop around it. And then the next scene, the barbarians are coming in and killing everybody here. And then the last scene, everything is gone. A few broken columns, and the headland is sticking up out of the ruins. So there's a kind of sense that in there, in this pretension, this imperial pretension, there's a kind of fate, there's a kind of darkness, and indeed German history from this time, from the 1830s now, before Bismarck, before their aggressive foreign policy, still with extraordinarily civilized kings, touched very much by the French Enlightenment, you feel that already it started, the wheel has started. Toward what finally came to Berlin was absolute ruin at the end of World War II. Now, it's a great building, I think, because it mirrors the great German archaeological discoveries in Asia Minor. It is after some, but it predates many, so that in a way it's a great prophecy. The great buildings in Asia Minor were Ionic temples. And the great thing about Ionic temples was that they had Ionic caps. And unlike Doric temples, the columns were very, very high. And there were lots of them, like this. And that's what you get here. You take, those Ionic temples would be 8 or 9 columns across. He just takes it and he stretches it. Then also, in the very early Ionic sanctuaries, like that of Hera on Samos, for example, is the first time we get the Greek stoa. And the Greek stoa is a kind of porch outlined by columns with offices or rooms behind it, which is very good to define a square. That's the way finally the agora came to be defined. So it takes all that Greek stuff and it makes it somehow very German. Those things are so finely cut, so hard. Again, you think of machinery, hard cut. When Corbusier writes about the Parthenon, he says the impressionists of polished steel. It isn't really so much on the Parthenon, but it is here. These wonderful colors, hard as metal, perfect. You really feel the craftsmanship and the will. Now, the other thing about it is that if it's a great image of an Ionic temple, and Germany now coming into its own as a great scientific, archaeological power and a center of learning and so on, it also is, it's eclectic. And in a way, Schinkel is one of the very first great eclectics. And I think we should say great, because what the eclectics did, and you see Schinkel doing it, they took things from the past as they chose. This was one of the real evils of modern architecture. I'm so much a modernist in the past, and I feel a little guilty really talking this way, but it's really true. They chose them boldly and combined them in ways that had never been seen before. They really invented with them, which is what historians like Grittian and so on won't allow them. They do that thing that Freud, who comes out at the end of the century, calls condensation, putting these opposites together for a new unity. For example, here, you got the great Ionic facade and the doubled Ionic columns back here. Then behind it, you have the Pantheon. You have Rome. And at the same time, you have the circle and the square, pretty much, right there. So it's a wonderful experience of opposites put together very boldly, that as you go behind those columns, and today, of course, it's still a museum, and it contains many of the great works of antiquity that the Germans dug up, and it goes around the first floor. If you can get up here, this is the way you used to go up to the upper level, which was here, so that you experience the Pantheon either in the full half circle from here, the lower level, or you're up here and very close here to the coffered dome up above. And then you look beyond it, and you get up there. There's the Pantheon. And then you look out, and you have the opposite. You have this great forest of Greek Ionic columns, and it's a wonderful experience between the two. And this place, you're here halfway up. You look at that French garden right there, and then the old Imperial Palace, which is now gone. And right over there it is. There's the Bau Academy, and it's red right there. And you see it's an intrusion. It's kind of a wonderful intrusion on all this wonderful cut masonry and so on. And it's all Prussian hard red brick. He was consciously trying to encourage the Prussian brick industry when he built it. Now I say he's an eclectic, and he works out the kind of eclecticism that becomes common in Germany, right through the Nazis. And the fact that the Nazis used it, of course, makes it unsympathetic. Can't hardly help that association, but nevertheless, it's a fact that works pretty well all through German history. That is to say, classical for public buildings, Gothic for churches, and he's just as good at Gothic as he is here. That's one of the Friedrich Kirche in Berlin. And notice again that in Gothic detail, it's just as hard and exact and precise. It's, again, very 19th century. It looks as if this is a man who's dealt with machines somehow. And he did try to encourage, as we'll see, the German iron industry as well as the brick industry. So he's involved with the modern techniques. But he uses Gothic for that. Then, however, out in Potsdam, at the palace, he may do little pavilions like this, or at Charlottenburg in Berlin itself, which are classical, basically, but fundamentally without style. Absolutely the kind of thing that Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson just used. Very close to being straight, especially Mies in his early work. Then when he gets out to the palace, his most famous building that he does in the late 20s and early 30s is the famous gardener's cottage there, which is eclectic, but it's a choice here for the picturesque, for the kind of farm building. And today, all through Coral Gables, you can find this building, or pieces of it. You find it in the work of George Hernandez. You find it in the work of a lot of other architects in Coral Gables. Almost the same organization of pergolas and masonry and small buildings related to other buildings and so on that he sets there. So that's another side of the eclectic mix that Schinkel is really the first one to put together. And many of his drawings in Italy, look as if they could have been done by a contemporary architect in terms of vernacular architecture. So from the classical to the vernacular, he has choices that he uses very eloquently in terms of what the program of the building is. You might say it's the beginning of that thing that Saarinen did so often later called the style for the job. It's really consciously that. Now, one style that he wanted to create himself to be sure was proper for the new kinds of jobs was modern, very clearly modern. And he thought of it as modern. And he went in 1826 to London, and he went to Manchester, and he sketched these warehouses along the river here. Just blocks with regular rows of windows, that's all. He saw that as a very positive thing, so that when he had a chance to build new kinds of buildings himself, like, oh yes, and I wanted to point out how close they are to actual warehouses they developed in Chicago. This is another Marshall Field bunch of warehouses, but it's later, it's 1906, right on that Chicago River. We saw it earlier, and you see it might be right here. Might almost have been conceived that way by Schinkel. When he comes to build the customs house of his, right on the Spree, same program, same place, same boats. It's basically the same as these, just dressed up a little with these string courses, but basically the same, and looks down past the Artist Museum to the Imperial Palace down there. So when he comes to build the Bar Academy, he takes that, basically the same thing, the cube, but now he wants to dress it up as much as he can. And it's that quality of the palazzo block I talked about before. It can be for one person or family or 100 families. It can be a factory, it can be a government building, it can be a warehouse like these. But it always can be decorated differently. So each one fits into a city, makes a city place, makes a block, but at the same time is individual. So you get the two things that one really would like to have, ideally, in any city building. What he wants to do is the same kind of thing that Alberti indicated on the Rucellai. You want to articulate the frame. And Alberti does it just drawing on the surface of the Rucellai, but his reflect, apparently, it's gone, as I say, but I hope they'll build it back, a whole set of bays going back through the fabric of the building of piers like this. The whole thing is reflected on the outside of its inner structure going down. And then there's a lot of use of iron in it and expression of iron as well as the expression of brick, like this. And again, as I say, it was red to exploit that Prussian brick as much as it could. So in every way, this is the beginning of a modern type, as we saw. And it's one of the beginnings before the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, 10 years before it or more. It's the beginning of the Chicago skyscraper mode, out of which the skyscraper is going to grow. And also, the iron, for example, in Prince Albert's palace of 1830-32, to encourage the iron industry, he has this major ceremonial staircase, which the prince was to descend in splendor, all of that in iron. Very slender, very elegant. And the sad thing about this is, it's gone. And the reason it's gone is it was the most hated, terrifying address in Berlin during the Nazi period. It was the headquarters of the Gestapo, Prince Albert's. And there's nothing there yet where this was. In any event. Now, you take Le Brousse, starting in 1843, here's a French architect, and he had German architects working for him, and he got along very well with the Germans. And it's one of the few periods in history when you wish that Charlemagne had never divided his empire, which said finally French against Germans irrevocably on the Rhine, because this is after the French aggression with Napoleon, and before the second Napoleon, who revived aggression, or Bismarck, who made it a policy of state. It's while France and Germany got along very well and interchanged ideas. And here's an idea that's very close. Here in 1843, that in 1832, you have basically the same details. The iron just as thin and elegant as they can make it. Then the light tracery of open-work joists, of arches inside. The whole thing light and open and all metal here on the inside, except for the enclosing walls. And that's the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris. Now, Le Brousse, as you know, is an architect who has the typical career that the French architect used to have. He would, if he won the Prix de Rome, say, at the Beaux-Arts, then he would go to Italy, and he would study it. Then he would come back, and he'd usually go back to his hometown. Tony Garnier went to Lille, for example, his town. And then he would build there. And he'd stay there. And he'd build maybe 2 or 3 buildings his whole life. He'd study them for years and years and years on one building. That's exactly what Le Brousse did. Only he came back to Paris. The Bibliothèque Geneviève, he works on it from 1830 to 1850. He works on it, he draws it, he changes it, he thinks about it. I mean, you have to understand this projection of all energies on one building for a long, long time. And he only built 3 or 4, as you know, in the long run. Now, Gideon in Space-Time and Architecture, I don't mean to keep attacking Gideon, but he comes up in this area. He talks about how wonderful this is. Then he says, oh, too bad the 19th century architects weren't equally bold on the outside. And he's angry because Le Brousse encloses it in a masonry shell, like that, as we already have seen. The reason he did it was very simple. It's because iron is inflammable. Iron will burn. And the Crystal Palace, which is the hero of, say, the 19th century history by Gideon and the modernists as a whole, Crystal Palace lasted a long time. It lasted finally till 1927, but it finally burned. You see it here. And there's nothing left of it today. And that's why this Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève was covered with a masonry cover. Now, see, that may be unimportant to the avant-garde, as it were, to the Gideon-esque mentality. It's only invention, it's only newness that counts. But of course, what counts much more is the city, how it shapes the city, its relation to the city, how the newness is in terms of the continuity of the place, of the city. And this is a wonderful thing from that point of view. You see it like this. It's defining a square right there. And that's really the square of the Pantheon. Now, the Pantheon is a church, started as a church in the 18th century, but by the end of the century, under Napoleon and so on, it became a real temple where the heroes of the New France were to be buried. And it's not quite like an English Westminster Abbey, but it's sort of like that. And poets and generals and so on are buried within it. Now, it's a very rhetorical building, as you say. It's very French rhetorical. It's like a French funeral oration. There's a lot going on like that. Classical allusions, big high column. And you see it wonderfully. You come here from the park, right here. And you come up this park, and Hemingway lived just behind it in a little square there. He claims having shot pigeons in the park because he couldn't even, this is all fiction, but he claims that he's pushing his baby, Bumby, in his carriage with the pigeons inside it, hidden by the blankets. He describes going up here this way from the park here, the Luxembourg Gardens, going up toward the Pantheon. Now, when you get up to the Pantheon, and where you just see its stairs going up to it, the Bibliothèque is the frame. It's the frame for the Pantheon's rhetorical stances. It's exaggerated height, and it's big columns and plain walls and big drum reaching up, all that. This is a quiet building, hard too. So it's as if this is like somebody writing prose, like Sinclair Lewis writing as many words in as he can. Get them all out, get it out. This is like really like Hemingway, not so much just craft it down hard, just craft it. It's there. And that's what it's like. And the way it gets that way is, I think, fascinating. First of all, it's different than the block of the Bio Academy because it's got a long, big square to define. It's on a height, too, and the Pantheon is way up there in the height, and this defines the Pantheon's actions in that long, long square. So it's not a block, it's more a bar building. It's only 4 bays deep, like this, and it's very, very long. Now you look at it with the arches and the columns, it looks a little bit like a viaduct, like an aqueduct, like the Claudian aqueduct in Rome. Now I show this because I've always thought that if he went to Rome, Brunelleschi certainly saw this aqueduct, and that might have been what created the Pitti Palace for him, like this. And the Pitti is a lot like that. You see, basically it's very shallow. It's only 1 bay here, and it's like an aqueduct. Go down like this. Though the original, of course, was only this far. There is that in it, but that isn't what Labrouste had in mind. When he went to Italy on the Prix de Rome, he studied the restorations of the temple of the Olympian Zeus at Acragas. Now, Acragas is a town in Sicily. It's a big town, a whole number of temples along the ridge line. And it and the other Greek states fought with the Carthaginians all the time for Sicily. And finally, in the middle of the century, about 450, they beat the Carthaginians at a place called the Himera River and captured thousands of Carthaginian prisoners whom they set to work, especially at Acragas, to build temples. And now a Greek temple is normally not built that way. A Greek temple is normally built by few sculptors carving it very carefully, very slowly, and a few workmen hoisting the things up into place. But here you had lots of labor. And here's Sicily. Sicily stands to Greece the way America does to Europe. It's bigger, vaster, more open. The details of the temples are bigger, more projecting, like the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, say, in America. But they built it too big. They designed it so big that they couldn't span with the usual limit. They couldn't get stone that would span. They couldn't work it out anyway. So they had to figure out how to do it. Now, this reconstruction of it says they did it this way. They had a cross wall between them here. Then halfway up, you had a platform on which stood a figure of Atlas, who holds up the world at Gibraltar. And that is an Atlantean figure. And he holds up here the middle of the lintel. Others disagree. But this is what Labrouste believed. This is what he saw. So he takes it this way, and he says he wants to build the way the Greeks would build if they had modern problems. So instead of the Atlantean figure, he has an arch. So that derives from the pilaster, the closed panel, and the glass, which makes arch. And that's where he says he gets this, like this. Now, again, it's the condensation you see. It's an eclectic reading of antiquity and a creative use of it. Now, the plan is interesting, too, because it's almost an archetype, and that's the proper word to use for it, a Jungian word for something that becomes a basic type that everyone believes in across the centuries, but they certainly believed it in the 19th century. And it really culminates in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, what you might call, what Jung would have called the death and resurrection experience. That's to say, you go into a low, dark place down below, tight and dark. Then you come up, and all of a sudden, you're hardly prepared for the great openness, the great light that comes up above. Freud talks about this too. He says the course of a successful analysis, you go through a dark defile, and you come out to the Aufklärung, to the light, to the enlightenment. up here, up above. That's exactly what you get there. Notice you have one tiny little entrance, tiny, and tiny little windows down here, and a string course here, and up above it you have something very different. You're not quite sure what it is, because you don't see it yet. But clearly it's more generous, more openness, more glass. But there's not, if you look at that, there's not a lot of glass in that building. You could look at the other way, as we will in a moment, the way Furnace did, and see it as almost all masonry. Tiny bits of glass, comparison to Bow Academy, for example. And anyway, you go through the darkness here, you come to staircases back here, which is lighted from above, and which had a copy of the School of Athens right there, and you come up in that great open space, which you saw there. So it goes like this. You go through a dark place. They paint on the walls to give you some sense of light, but you wouldn't have had that light. There's no light coming from above like that. But you see the light at the end. Then you go up and it opens out, and that's the way it looks at a wall. This is the way it looks in the middle, with the column coming down and that's the way you look when you get away from the wall out into space like this. And so there you get that wonderful interior space, all that light, all that openness. But what makes it a city building, and he thought about it a lot, I have a feeling much more than he thought about this. He thought about how to work that whole thing to express the interior, to tell you how it's built, to tell you what's going on there, and to describe itself. Now that's again a very 19th century thing. Here's a modern program, which is a modern, more or less, public library. So what does it enclose? Books. So he puts the names of the authors here. And as a matter of fact, the books are right behind them in the thickness of the pier there, are the books behind it there in the show. So he has structure, function, and what you might call architecture parlance, speaking architecture, telling you what it means, telling you who's inside it. Now, Richardson doesn't use, and they don't use it in America much, that speaking architecture. Some later with the classic revival. But everything else he picks up. Only now, you see, it's all space. You feel where that's so tight, so French, so tight. This almost seems American and casual. It's full, it's big, it's heavily rusticated, but he shows you it has only a certain thickness. You can feel the light structure inside. You can feel the space all open inside. However, and we could go right from there to Sullivan, really, but however, I'd like to show you one other thing. A man named Frank Furnace in Philadelphia, who saw this just the opposite, looked at exactly the same buildings. And by the way, Labrousse, for reasons we know, but it doesn't sound right, called that neo-Greek, New Greek, because it really was, he said, the Greeks, the way the Greeks would have built if they had to build with our problems. So New Greek, so he calls this neo-Greek too, here, Furnace. But here's a wall of a building of his where Labrousse might have had the windows there, but there are no windows here at all. Not at all. Tiny little window down below. Little tabs like this indicate the pilasters. Everything else is tight and hard. He sees the solidity of it. And then he gets a building that looks very different. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Greeks. It has that wall at the side, solid. Windows threatened. Look how tiny the windows are and how he threatens them. And even here in the beginning, he's got an archway that divides the entrance so it's hard to get in. He's got this window is threatened. And he has here the famous Carnet en délit. Here in masonry, but as they were in France. Now, the Carnet en délit is described by the name. The column, the colonnet, the little column, en délit, against the bed. En flagrante delito is when you're caught in the wrong bed. And they mean the bed of the quarry. In 12th century cathedrals, some of them, one school in France, in the Ile-de-France, they had two systems of structure. One was the wall, where the masonry was cut with the bed and laid down with mortar, which meant the French felt it could compress like this. They go up. Then a totally different system that is not connected with the wall, separate from the wall. These are the Carnet en délit. These are cut and then stood up against the bed. And there's no mortar. They're connected here, dry, with these annulets. So the French felt that the wall started to give under the ribs, you see. Each one expresses a rib. It's important. This would hold. And if there's too much weight on it, it will what the French call déliter. which is the word that you get it in the quarry when the stone starts to flake away. And you can find 2 or 3 of these in French cathedrals where there has been too much weight and they're buckling. So that's the system. Now, the 19th century people then see who are going to work in iron, like Viollet-le-Duc or at the Crystal Palace. They love this because it looks like iron tubes. And you can be sure if the French had had them then in the 12th century, they would have used them if they'd had them at industrial scale. See, the Crystal Palace is all en délit. Basically that, in iron. And that's what he's doing there. You see, he's got them there, and he's showing them being compressed by weight, barely holding up the weight, barely open the windows like this. Indeed, Viollet-le-Duc loved to make drawings like this, showing the Carnet en délit, holding up enormous weights, great masses, compressing it. Well, that's exactly what he does when you go in those stairs, going up this frontispiece of the building, like the New Haven City Hall, just the one bay is entrance. These are all studios and offices back there. When you go up there to the doorway that connects this entrance area to those, here you get all of a sudden a wall which seems to be pushed apart by an enormous wrench, like a Stillson wrench. You open like this, which seems to be under enormous compression here. See that? But it has nothing to do with this diapered wall pattern on both sides. It's sort of insecurely attached to the wall, but there's enormous pressure on it. You feel it being compressed, that Carnet en délit. And to get to it, as I say, you have to go around the entrance, which stops you. First you have the one on the outside, then you come a few steps in, this is one side. You go past it, and look, you see that? It's like the revolt of matter against space. You don't see much architecture like this, as if matter is going to crush the space. He doesn't, the space is under threat from these enormous, big industrial forms that are just holding it apart and pushing it like this under enormous pressure. Now, there's a lot of imagery that's basically industrial in the 19th century. Oh, you see it there. You see how it looks like wallpaper in the middle of these things, which are insecurely, but very threatened, set up at the edges like that. For example, in New Haven, you know, these are Egyptian closed-bud papyrus, which should be soft and rounded, but they make them hard-edged like something in a factory, like a machine part in Whitney's factory down the road. Now that's a gentle example, but you see what he does. That's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, of course, of 1872, then the Provident Bank and Trust Company of 1879, and look what he does. These are like a machine with pistons which are being compressed. You can almost feel them squeak in heat. They need oil, and they crush the housing. Then it crushes the windows. Then it crushes this down here. The whole mass up above just crushes the building, and if there's any space in there, you feel it's really threatened. That thing might collapse on top of you inside. Now, there was an American critic who wrote about this and said it was typical of American 19th century architecture because it took part of a European building and made a whole building of it. And he's referring to Pier Foam, a chateau north of Chantilly that we talked about before, where again, Viollet-le-Duc, you see where he gets his windows and his figures in the windows from this. This whole frontispiece, it's like this entrance piece where these are being pushed into the ground. But actually, while it's a good visual analysis, that isn't really the case because that itself was only part of a much larger building. Originally, you see, it was just here. There it is. Look at it. And it had a little high roof itself on it. And it was part of this enormous building of the Provident Life and Trust Company. Then the rest of it was torn down. And then, how tragically, in Philadelphia, with a stupid mall they created, this was torn down too. Everybody was against it. The Beaux-Arts people were against it. Louis Mumford were against it. It was just much too tough. We should remember this because we involved with the new urbanism care very much about harmony in cities, relationships and things. But you know, sometimes you need the bad guy. You really do. You really do. You need it very much. You get it in cities anyway, don't you? That's the life of the city. For example, look at this. Look at how he must have looked. Oh yes, what he's also thinking of is an engine. See those, this is 1879. In 1876, there was the big Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, which I'll talk about again later. One thing it did was make Americans excited about machinery. And this was the coreless steam engine. It's enormous. Maybe there's a figure down here. Maybe that's, I don't know. The figures are small in here. Like this, people come look at it like this and push it down. And that's exactly what he's doing in the building. Those things are pushing down. They squeal with heat when they float in there. The whole thing starts to crumble. And then right down, when you're walking on the sidewalk, look out there. It's like it. And it's like this other machine there. Thump, you feel like them. Thump. It really is like, he's a very strange architect. He's a wonderful architect. It's like the revolt of matter, turning architectures inside out. Not the creation of environment, not the creation of space, basically. The threatening of space. Threatening of space with these masses. And you see what it must have looked like. Look at that thing. And I keep thinking, you know, when everybody was against Libeskind's proposal for that museum in England, the Victorian Auburn, where he wanted to make, this is a very early sketch, but they're not so different. There's that great thing crumbling with the mass here on both sides. That one, like one of Michelangelo's slaves trying to get the rock off his head and so on. This is much like it. And that, of course, was shot down finally. It's not going to be built. Maybe it's wise, maybe not. But I keep thinking you need these. You can't let them take over. You can't, that's the point of the planner, not to let them take over, but you got to use them. You got to use the Frank Gehry's and the Libeskins and so on. Sometimes nobody can do it as well. Anyway, there's Furnace. Everybody conspired in the 20s and 30s to tear his buildings down. And see, there it is, the inside. There's actually a lot of space in there. But it doesn't have a lot of glass, not a lot of light, really. And outside, you'd never know it, like a crumpled mass. Now, this is 1879. Really, at exactly the same time, 1831, a very different architect is working out of French materials. And that's Henry Hobson Richardson. And this is the first Ames store in Boston of 1831. You see, he works, see what I mean? He works with space. The whole thing is burgeoning space. Take a look at it. And where the exterior, see, is a shell that's being expanded. You really feel it. The principle is a volume. Right? The principle here is a collapsing mass. The principle here is a volume of space which is contained with that wonderful surface of Richardson's, which he always gives a thickness. That's a body. It's really there. And they're calling that on Dely, but he only uses them just to continue the surface. Going across like that. Okay. And then finally he develops, by 1886, he does the second Ames store, which is all one act of lift. And from there we could go right to Sullivan's climactic skyscraper, last one he did with Adler, in Buffalo of 1896, the Guarantee Building, where the colonnade goes all the way up and arches over. The whole thing stretches and stirs upward. But again, I'd like to talk about something else first, and that is a couple of other buildings by Richardson. For example, Seaver Hall in Harvard. Again, in terms of defining a space. Now, it defines the yard in Harvard, but behind it is a street, and the museum is there, the Fogg Museum. So this building defines the interior space, but it leads you in, as you'll see, and out the other side. Now you can see how that differs. Here it is in 1878. How it differs from Sturgis at Yale in the 1860s in Farnum Hall. This is all flat wall, thin, sharp edged, so the wall looks thin, cut staccatically, whatever it is, like this, hard edged, penetrated, so everything is thin, activated, separate from each other part. That's all continuity. Yeah? How he takes that whole thing and he spreads those things. Then it's also the surface, though, is continuous too. Feel it. The space is continuous too. Now at the same time too, it's part of that very important movement we'll talk about later. It's part of the colonial revival because it's picking up 18th and early 19th century Harvard buildings like Houghton Hall here of the very early 19th century. See, it's like that. It's got its pediment. But where this has the thin surface, and the separate windows, that surface is made thick, and the windows go in horizontal bands. So he wants to make you feel that that surface is really thick. So when you go to it, he's really kidding you because the wall isn't that thick. But these wonderful brick makers he must have had, with this where they can mold this brick. You take you in, you see it there, and as you go in, that little panel pops out above you. Pops out as if, in fact, you're displacing a certain amount of air. Everything is about going in there, but on the other side, toward the museum, everything is coming out. It curved. And the detail of the doorway could be sliced off with a razor. No depth. But what it is almost the most beautiful expression of the surface. You feel the thickness of the surface, certain thickness containing the volume. This is what Venturi picks up when he talks about generic architecture. And instead of over-designing a building for a specific function, you work it out so it can be used for almost anything inside. You design the surface, so that becomes very important. He does it differently. He incorporates the windows into the thickness of the wall, which he shows you. He gives you the idea somehow that they're just as thick as the wall. See, they're not holes. No. Richardson's windows are behind, but otherwise it's very much the same. That surface, there it is, which spreads. Now that's exactly what you get, as you've already seen in the Marshall Field warehouse. You get that wonderful stretch of the surface, but it has an integrity and a thickness, and behind it you feel the space, contained, continuous, but full of life inside it. And there you get the type. Now, once developed, this type becomes the type for almost all the American downtowns that were built at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Most American downtowns all over the United States have this building, which means in the end the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève and Schinkel's Bar Academy behind them as a type. For example, Sullivan picks it up right away in the Walker Warehouse. And he tries to change it. He tries to make a smooth surface. He doesn't want it to feel like a surface which is extended by space. He wants it to be a thick surface. The space is way back there. More Roman, as it were. Cut. Deeper, but sharper. But it's the same type. You can decorate it differently. Or when he comes here to do the Auditorium Hotel, which I'll talk about later, and theater in Chicago. You see, it's this. Give it 2 more stories down here. Go these up to 5, and bring it up above, and you make a bigger building, like this, but the same type. Or you get to Denver, they have that beautiful pink stone that they seem to get out there in the Rockies. Wonderful downtown. Denver has a good preservation group, too, as you know. Same basic thing, handled differently, same place. Or all the way out to Portland, Maine. When Inouye Graves, when he does his building there, it comes out of this type, this block. And here it is in a different thing, a different material, different stone, decorated differently, but the same type. And all of those types on the American grid, like here at Chicago. Now here we have the Marshall Field Warehouse down here somewhere on the square grid. Up here, as I said, you had some wonderful blocks which are long and thin, which are cut through like this, through there. And there you get a building that all of a sudden breaks the type, but fits exactly onto its urban situation. And this is the great Monadnock Building by Burnham and Root. Charles Burnham and what's his name, Wellborn Root. Now, you see, it's narrow. It's not like the Bow Academy. It's not a block like the Marshall Warehouse. It's only this number of bays, really 2 big bays and 3 half bays like this, and an alley going right down through. It's wonderful. Then it doesn't have the palazzo sense of the cube. Everything about it seems to grow like a plant. And his drawings, Root's drawings, because Root is the great designer of the two, though Burnham is a great architect too, he has papyrus in mind, growing Egyptian papyrus. And it's interesting because Egyptian papyrus grows out of mud, and that's what the Chicago foundations are, as you know. When they build these big buildings, they have to sink the foundations and caissons in the mud down there. You can't get to bedrock. It's mud. They're floated. It's fascinating. So the higher they go, the deeper it has to get. It's funny, they're going in both ways at the same time. And they're willing to do a lot down there to get this. So it's growing out of the mud, in fact. And so then, more than that, you see how everything about it is emphasizing, as no other building had yet, this vertical continuity, that growth up. And even the cornice is more Egyptian. You don't get a cornice that stops it like classical. It just is that growth type that you get here. And it's heavier down here and lighter up there. This is their Monadnock Building. They did in '85, and you see there they didn't know how to do it. They're afraid of it. They have 3 stories of that. He only just has 6 in the bottom there. And then they make this big. And they add string courses everywhere. Here they throw all that out of this wonderful vision he has of this papyrus growing out of the mud. And then the other thing is that it's not like the Marston Field. It's not masonry over a steel covering back, basically a light frame. It's a heavy wall-bearing, so of course the other, but a heavy wall-bearing building with transverse walls occasionally to stiffen it, which take up an enormous amount of the space. As you can see, and this is one reason, of course, they wanted to go to the skyscraper construction of steel and weatherproofing so you could rent that space, so you could sell it. But it's big, heavy. And when you go up, you notice, you can see it even here, the windows are deep here. They're farther out here. In the middle, you have this type, which is not back behind those walls, but is coming out to the light. Now, they exploit that. The way he exploits that is really wonderful. You have the lower floor is taking the compression of all that mass, and he shows it coming out at you. And there's a window back there, but you don't even see it. It's black, right? And then the windows here, right, but these windows are coming out into the light, like that. And as you go up, you get the 2 opposites. You see it wonderfully here. This is expressing the massive structure of the bearing wall, deep. This is expressing the light. So you get the structure and the will to the light. It pushes to the light. And it reflects the light when it gets out there. So you can see right away you're dealing with very different things. You see it there. The windows back don't reflect, the windows back outdo. And what you get is this wonderful solid, deep cut in, and then this gleam and this darkness, the gleam of the glass, the gleam of the window. I don't know any more eloquent expression. And here it is, you see, it's not even skyscraper construction. It's not steel frame construction at all. It's old-fashioned masonry construction. Now, no sooner do they build this in 1890 than they make an addition. You see it on the other end. And the addition is very different. The addition has a classical cornice that stops it, like that. And then it has what now look to us compared to that rather banal stiff frame. They do have one bay system in the center because now they have the steel frame inside it, carrying its own fireproofing on it. But you can hardly say that this is a more moving building than that. Indeed, it isn't. I mean, compared to that, this one normally seems rather stiff, rather common, rather usable. So you can't say that it's that construction that makes the Chicago skyscrapers. What I think is the greatest skyscraper in Chicago doesn't use it at all, which is the Monadnock, as we see it there originally. Now, the way it begins, as you know, is with William LeBaron Jenney, who'd been an engineer in the Union Army in 1884. He builds this bank building here, and you see it's a lot like the Monadnock, the Montauk, divided this way, big entrance. Doesn't look much different, but in fact, it is steel frame, mostly steel, some iron, supporting its own fireproofing. You see it here. There's the steel column. Here it's in a kind of infilling in a bay, as we'll see in a minute, where the major columns are. You see how it's supporting the fireproofing and the girder, which is up above there, and it's carrying its own fireproofing. And that fireproofing is about 100 times better than the fireproofing on the World Trade Center was. The fireproofing on the World Trade Center, some of it was just sheetrock, some of it was just squirted on. There are many photographs even before of where it's all gone. And maybe it would have been better if it had been the very first building built. The most primitive type had this big, solid, heavy brick fireproofing. And then you see the major columns, though, is one in which the column is basically vertically continuous. You have these kind of saddles into which the beams come, the girders come. And then they're all fixed together in various kinds of ways. But you see the type. So the type comes out when he finally comes to the Fair store in 1891. That's 1884, and unfortunately it's torn down. Now he's got it worked out. You've got the basic continuity of the column. You've got the basic fact that the girder is back behind the plane of the column. You get a proportion which is based on the fact that you want to span that just as far as you can get away with. And you want the floor ceiling just as low as you can rent, because you want maximum space to rent in there. That's all you want. You have no symbolic intention, whatever, here. And you like some glass, some of it fixed and some of it open. So you get, as it finally fixed here, you get a typical Chicago window with the central plane usually fixed here, apparently open on both sides. That's the type. And if you take that and just derive the building's facade from that, like this, with, again, the basic verticality of the column with the girders riveted into it, like this, you get buildings like these on Michigan Boulevard by Halliburton and Roche of 1898. These two by Halliburton and Roche, this one by Sullivan, was the same structure. He's working for Halliburton and Roche, but he won't do this. I'll talk about that later. He will not do it. He doesn't like it. But here's your typical, pragmatically arrived at Chicago window. There's the continuity of the column. There's the girder coming across. And there's the Chicago window. And it's not great, you know. Now, that's exactly, very few people kept up doing the old bays. Now, Root did. John Welborn Root did it just before his death in 1893 in the Reliance building, which is now frame, lightly clad, so you feel it much more as cladding metal inside, and with the bays projecting into the light. But that's about it. Everybody else liked it just straight like that. And when Mies van der Rohe came along in 1955 to do the buildings right there on the lake, the great lakeshore apartments, you see the system you get. There's the beam, there's the column, there's the beam. Here are continuous mullions going up like that. No Chicago window, it's going to be air conditioned. The mullions are here outside the column, which has to be thicker because it needs fireproofing. So you indicate the column in steel outside the fireproofing. So you get two things. You get the building rising, but you get an insistence on the horizontal section of the bay. And that quality you feel here, when you read the whole thing, there are sort of two opposites. Now, Mies sometimes doesn't like that, so he keeps the column behind, so you don't read the thickness of the column. You only read the continuity of the mullions. That's what he does in the Commonwealth apartments in 1957. So you get a slab now. This is what he does in Seagram's, because he wants to define Fifth Avenue on a plaza. So this way is a slab which can shape a space. Yeah, better than this one, which takes your eye off it to those other conditions, those other problems. Now, on the other hand, I think the greatest Miesian skyscraper is not by Mies at all, but it's by a young architect named Jacques Brownson, working for that big Chicago firm of C.F. Murphy in 1963 or 4, I think it was. Since that time, Brownson has been almost unknown. He went to Denver. He was running an architecture school there for a while. Never read about him. I don't know what he did afterward. But Brownson is the builder of this building, which is the Chicago Civic Center. And he did it in Corten steel. You see it here. And he had the system here where he'd have the fewest columns as possible. And the bay now would not, instead of that old bay, which was the most sort of economical either way, but you're going to express it as great bridges. And the girders got big coming across, but you kept the mullions back, so you felt this void. And the great big 4 columns, bigger down here, getting smaller as they go up higher, like that, stepped in there and shaped this plaza. And they did it in a very contextual manner, because hard and strong as that is, it's really wonderfully contextual with the pre-existing civic building, which is here, whose basic proportional system is verticals, much like these, horizontals, behind these columns, but you see these two somehow get along. And the little inconsequential Picasso is out there in front. Mies, according to number of architects who worked for him, he's supposed to have said, when he saw this building, he's supposed to have said, "We've lost the war." But Brownson didn't do it right. Mies would never have done this, never have stretched it like that. And he hated it, but I think it's really a very great building. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what Louis Sullivan started to do when he started to design his skyscrapers. Louis Sullivan, whose name is always associated as the main designer of the skyscraper. But he doesn't do the first ones. He's right along in there after Halliburton and Root, and so, after Brenham and Root and so on. But the first one is not in Chicago, but it's in St. Louis, that other great city of that westward expansion that I talked about. And it's the Wainwright Building. Now you see, he's not after an expression of a big steel frame inside. Matter of fact, though he acknowledges the frame, say, by making all this the same and having continuate pilasters, nevertheless the frame is only behind every other one. So these are gratuitous. He wants it tight. Secondly, you don't feel it light. You feel it articulate into a grid. You feel the whole building as a chunk. It's a palazzo chunk. Now, he doesn't do what the Marshall Field Warehouse had done with the arches and so on. He doesn't pick that up from him. He's on his own now. But what he says is like, if you look at the very first palazzi themselves, say the Medici Riccardi in this drawing, he wants, what he says is the base, the shaft, and the capital, which is what you get there. And he goes back to a great big cornice. And he usually associates this with a Greek column. The base here, which is your entrance, so it should be special. This, the shaft, which should be all the same, like a column because they're all offices. And then the utilities up above to end it off, so have the great capital. But it really is like this, with the changing rustication in a way. Then the big dome here, and not much bigger than the other buildings on the street. I mean, it fits right into its street where it comes, like this. But it's set off from the other buildings around it by the continuity of those vertical pilasters. Now there you have a feeling again he's looking, this time at Palladio, I think, the Villa Valmarana, which is in the same kind of urban situation. You got a narrow street, as I said, you got to come up and look at it. Look at the buildings on both sides. They look a lot like those buildings. And Sullivan's was in a group of other buildings. I'll show you in a moment. Never meant to stand by itself. Never meant to be seen so you could see only 4 bays like this. Never meant. It's supposed to be a chunk. Anything as you look, as you saw before. And the same kind of urban situation, no different than that of an Italian town. A little bigger, but the same type, same problems, same issue. And of course, he couldn't match the wonderful hand carving, I suppose, where you don't know where the wall is, that wonderful ambiguity and liveliness in the wall. But he does very well. And a very good dissertation that a fellow started and then somehow never was able to finish about Sullivan's relationship to the trades. It's very important because, you know, modern architects always complain that, or they did half a generation ago, that nobody could do the work. Contractors and craftsmen were gone. That's because they didn't demand it anymore. Just like Latin beginning to disappear from colleges because, from private schools, from schools, elementary schools, because colleges no longer demanded it. Same way with this. See, he demanded it and he got it. He got this wonderful rounded bricks. He got these terracotta things made up to his designs in the factory. They were proud to do it. They were happy to do it. And it gives it a great richness, which is very different from Palladio. It's hard, sort of like an American flag out there in that heat, you know, St. Louis. Hard in the heart of the center of the town. Indeed, it's like that, you know. The Mississippi is behind us. We might even be on Saarinen Arch, which is right here. Then there's this old great 19th century state house or courthouse or whatever it is. And too much redevelopment took that out. And this junk came in. And these were slated to go down and eventually were taken down to have a kind of meaningless access go to that building. And this building, right there to the right. So everything you saw there that gave it a meaning was taken away. And you see where it is, it's a chunk. That's the way you're meant to see it, the way there. Now, the reason it was saved in 1974 was because both the governor of the state and the mayor had taken courses. One took one at Princeton, one took one at Yale. It said this was a great building. But that wasn't enough, because they didn't get it. And I'm sorry to say that I was on the committee that chose it. And the one that got it was a feeble design by a man named Jurgala, who, you see, cut down all those buildings, which they wanted, but the rest of the committee said, no, they should leave them, and took away the wonderful alley, made sort of Japanese garden. And you see, all of a sudden, the building is what? This is Sullivan, and that's probably Adler's uncle who designed that back there. That's just, there it is. That's the building you're supposed to see. It's designed for the street. It's really undesigned back there. All wrong. On the other side, here, that view, for example, changes, and that's what you see now. All wrong. And I'll never forget, and you should bear this in mind, when I saw these drawings, there was one entry that did this. It's all the way back here. It hit this, or it blocked it all off, with a great big beam, which came across right to the corner. And all that building was back and it was hollow. So you saw the chunk of this building and the hollow of this building. So you saw it the way you should, even though it seemed a daring and illogical scheme. And I stood down here for a long time looking up and then finally saying, the scale's too big, it's just too big, it's too big. So regretfully I went for this, though I did recommend, we all did, they not tear any of those down at all. In any event, that's what happened. And it was a great mistake, with all the best will in the world. We'll talk about that more next time. Thanks.